You know that restless feeling, right? That
Yeah.
urge to just like get up and go somewhere new.
Oh, definitely. Everyone feels that wanderlust sometimes.
But imagine that feeling completely taking over, becoming this overwhelming need to just wander aimlessly.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're diving into today, this historical concept called dromomania,
Right, dromomania. It was actually a psychiatric diagnosis back in the day.
sometimes called traveling fugue, apparently.
Yeah.
It described this uncontrollable desire to roam.
Exactly. And while we don't really use the term clinically much anymore, looking at its history is, well, it's fascinating.
It tells us a lot about how we've understood travel,
Mhm.
restlessness, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And the word itself, dromomania, it gives you clues.
You're
It's
right.
from the Greek dromos,
Yeah.
meaning running or a course,
Hmm.
and mania. And mania itself has a pretty interesting backstory.
Oh, it's not just, madness.
Well, not always. Historically, its meaning shifted. Sometimes it meant irrational obsession, sure, but other times, just like intense enthusiasm.
Interesting. So our mission for this deep dive is what exactly? To trace where this diagnosis came from.
Yeah, basically, understand how doctors saw it, what was going on socially, and maybe why thinking about it now still gives us, some food for thought.
Okay, so let's start with mania. You said it wasn't always negative.
Right. Our sources say back in the 17th century, you could use mania just to describe being really, really enthusiastic about something.
Like a huge passion for it.
Exactly, a really intense focus. But then its use kind of broadened.
How so?
We start seeing it tacked onto Greek roots as a suffix, describing things seen as irrational obsessions.
Like.
Things like hippomania, this extreme thing for horses, or nymphomania.
Okay.
But interestingly, around the same time, the French started using manie for specific enthusiasms.
So a bit closer to the original sense.
Sort of, and that usage then crossed over into English. Think of words like bibliomania.
A massive love of books, maybe a bit over the top, but not necessarily pathological.
Precisely. And that original enthusiastic meaning didn't totally die out. There's this mention of the poet Coleridge coining scribblomania.
Scribblomania. I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah.
It's a real drive to write, maybe excessively, but not clinically irrational.
Exactly. So you see this spectrum within the historical idea of mania, from just intense interest to something doctors considered a problem.
Okay, so if we take dromos, the running, the wandering, and add this shifting idea of mania.
Then we start to see how dromomania took shape as a clinical idea.
And clinically, how was it defined? The sources say it was this overwhelming, like, irresistible urge.
Yeah, an urge to just wander, travel, walk. Aimlessly, it wasn't about a destination.
No goal in mind.
Nope. The core thing was just the act of moving.
What's really wild is how some accounts describe the people experiencing it.
You mean the automatic state?
Yeah, like they weren't fully conscious during these trips. Almost like sleepwalking, but traveling.
And the partial amnesia, too,
Yeah.
forgetting the journeys afterwards.
Can you imagine waking up, essentially, in some strange city with zero memory of how you got there?
It sounds incredibly disorienting, really unsettling.
And it wasn't just the wandering, was it? The sources mention other symptoms. Pretty serious ones.
That's right. Things like losing your sense of personal identity.
Wow.
And even, in some cases, impulses towards violence, homicide, or suicide.
Okay, that definitely takes it way beyond simple wanderlust.
Absolutely. That's why, historically, it was classified as an impulse control disorder.
Like kleptomania, the stealing thing, or pyromania.
Exactly. Same category. The idea was this powerful, uncontrollable impulse that just took over.
Seems like this diagnosis really took hold in France. Specifically, why there?
Yeah, our research definitely points to French psychiatrists doing most of the early defining and documenting.
Hmm.
And it's quite revealing how that concept was then adapted or maybe twisted in America.
You mean drapetomania?
Yes, drapetomania, the so-called mental illness invented to explain why enslaved people would try to escape.
That's just chilling. It shows how social context, power structures can completely warp what gets labeled a mental disorder.
It really does, pathologizing a perfectly natural desire for freedom.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
About who gets to define what's normal or disordered.
Absolutely. It's often tied up with the dominant social norms and who holds the power.
So moving forward a bit, how does this historical idea connect to, say, modern psychiatry? Are there equivalents?
Well, some connections are drawn. The bioethicist Hank Ten Have, for example, suggests it's similar to what the DSM-IV called dissociative fugue.
Dissociative fugue. That also involves unexpected travel and memory loss, right?
Exactly. Loss of identity, wandering, amnesia about your past. There are definite overlaps.
And there were other historical terms, too.
Yeah. The Germans had Wandertrieb, which literally just means urge to wander.
Uh-huh.
And the French also used automatisme ambulatoire.
Automatic walking? Sounds familiar.
Right. Again, pointing to this idea of moving without conscious control.
But as a distinct diagnosis, Dromomania itself kind of faded out in the 20th century.
That's right. You won't find it listed in, like, the DSM-5 today.
But the phenomenon, maybe,
Yeah.
the intense urge to travel or wander, that didn't just vanish.
No, not necessarily. And the sources mention some really striking historical cases. They really bring it to life.
Like Jean-Albert Dadas, the French gas fitter,
Yeah, his story is incredible.
traveling huge distances, Prague, Vienna, even Moscow.
Right, and then having absolutely no memory of any of it.
It's like something out of a weird dream or maybe a nightmare.
Totally. A medical student named Philippe Tissier documented his case really carefully.
And didn't the famous neurologist Charcot describe similar things?
He did. Jean-Martin Charcot. He used that term, automatisme ambulatoire, really focusing on the lack of conscious control over the walking or traveling.
You can't really separate these diagnoses from the society they came out of, though.
Definitely not.
Our sources point out that Dromomania was kind of part of a whole group of labels for people who moved around a lot.
Labels like bum, hobo, vagrant.
Right. And Dromomania was like the most extreme medicalized version of that.
Exactly. It was seen as the pathological end of that spectrum. In the early 20th century, it was even classed as a criminal mania.
A criminal mania.
Seriously.
Yeah, lumped in with things like kleptomania and pyromania, and linked to so-called psychopathic personalities who supposedly lacked purpose.
Wow. So it wasn't just about mental state, it was about social deviance too.
Very much so. It really highlights the anxiety societies felt about people who didn't settle down, who didn't fit the mold of having a fixed home and job.
It got tied up with regulating homelessness and vagrancy.
Right. There's this underlying belief, almost, that people who constantly traveled somehow lost the ability to live a settled life.
That reflects a real bias towards sedentary living, doesn't it? Pathologizing movement.
It does. Which makes this alternative idea from the travel writer Richard Grant really interesting.
Oh yeah, what was that? He basically suggests maybe Dromomania isn't a disorder at all. Maybe it's just what happens when settled cultures pathologize a natural human instinct.
An instinct left over from our nomadic hunter-gatherer days.
Exactly. That urge to explore, to move. Maybe it's deeply wired in us.
That flips the whole thing on its head.
It really does.
Yeah.
The source even speculates about someone like Francis Xavier, the famous missionary who traveled constantly, that maybe people back then might have looked at him and suspected something like Dromomania.
It forces you to think about the cultural lens we use. Is constant movement inherently bad? Or is that just our settled perspective?
Right.
But, okay, even though it's not a diagnosis anymore, the term Dromomania hasn't completely disappeared. It seems to be popping up again.
It has, yeah. In the 21st century, you see articles cropping up again, but in slightly different contexts.
Like what?
Linking it sometimes to symptoms and conditions like Alzheimer's disease or dementia or delirium.
Where wandering and disorientation can be a real issue.
Exactly. And in those specific cases, there have even been attempts to use antipsychotic meds to try and manage that wandering behavior.
Okay, that's one angle. But there's another way it's used now, too, right? More informally.
Yeah, this broader non-clinical use. Just describing people who have this incredibly strong, almost consuming need to be constantly traveling.
Like extreme wanderlust, maybe to the point where it actually causes problems in their life.
Sort of, yeah. An insatiable need for movement.
And didn't one philosopher use it even more metaphorically?
Yes. Paul Virilio. He talked about Dromomania in terms of modern society's obsession with speed.
Speed.
Yeah, like this frantic addiction to always pursuing the future, never stopping, never being still, a feature of our fast-paced lives.
That's a different take.
And other thinkers have run with that idea too, connecting it to finance capitalism, globalization, this constant pressure for movement, progress, change.
So it went from a medical thing to almost a social critique.
In a way, yeah. Some people use hypermobility or dromomania critically now to talk about how much Western culture values, maybe overvalues, frequent long-distance travel.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've seen Dromomania start as this specific clinical diagnosis, mainly in 19th century France.
Right, describing that uncontrollable urge to wander, often with amnesia, sometimes with darker impulses.
Then it falls out of clinical fashion, but the term lingers.
Yeah,